Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. On today's podcast, we have Nakul Malhotra, VP Emerging Opportunities Portfolio, Maritime Services for the Wilhelmsen Group. As Vice President for Emerging Opportunities Portfolio, Nakul deeply engaged in the company's corporate venturing endeavors and is an avid proponent of bridging industry domain expertise with new age technology capabilities. Nakul got his start at sea, making his way through the engine room ranks, earning his chief engineer's ticket, and holds an MBA from the Manchester Business School. Thank you for coming on the podcast. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Chris. And as you mentioned, my background very much starts, from a seafaring perspective. Spent some time on the tankers, as you mentioned, got my chief's ticket. Fortunate enough to come ashore in the UK with a company that was a joint venture between BP Marine and Unitor. At the time, it was a really interesting concept. It was like a consolidated front end for the entire product range for the Unitor side, which included, of course, gases, welding machines, welding electrodes, chemicals, etc. And on the BP Marine side, the lubes and fuels. And the idea was to bring more companies on board and sort of have a one-stop shop kind of a concept. And bearing in mind that that was kind of 2000, 2001, so maybe a bit ahead of its time. So the company dissolved, and I had the opportunity to go into Unitor, which was subsequently acquired by Wilhelmsen. Spent a lot of time in different geographies in the UK, wider Europe, the Indian subcontinent, Africa, Middle East, Black Sea, then Asia Pacific, and was able to spend quite a lot of time in multiple functions. So operations, supply chain management, the service piece, sales, and then went into product management, product development, product lifecycle considerations, and taking a look at our portfolio. And I think around 2013, I had this sort of, well, to some degree, existential crisis. And I sort of felt that I was just, careening fast towards irrelevance. I mean, I think we started to feel the initial stages of digital coming in. It was super early, but things were changing, and the products that I was working on were very much the traditional products. Of course, we had a lot of product development elements in it, but not as digital as we now know it to be needed. And so we started with a small venture team in the product management piece, try to understand what internal venturing was about. Developed that a little bit further, made some mistakes along the way, lots of learning, and started playing into other technologies, IoT, 3D printing, etc. And then moved into kind of the open innovation piece. And it just seems like a really big step, but it's kind of built step by step, where today I spend my time in VC, I spend my time with maritime tech startups, I spend my time with both equity and non-equity partnerships, incubators, accelerators, trying to really connect early stage startups, trying to connect other corporate venture aspects with our own corporate ambitions, and really try to build partnerships and try to build products and elements that we believe will be of interest to our customers in the future, and also elements that we believe drive the industry forward. And it's super exciting. But the connection from being a seagoing marine engineer to being in corporate venture capital was, lots of steps along the way.
Well, yeah, and I think we talked before that it's never a direct line, right? It's always kind of a little roundabout, or however you want to go there. You touched upon a lot of really interesting things that we could chat about. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned is around that 2013 era about having an existential crisis. Interesting enough, that's kind of where I maybe a little bit after that, where I started to have the same sort of thoughts, and I looked at it almost a positive thing. I have this great domain background in maritime, different from what you have. Even though we've had this kind of, you and I had this epiphany, or whatever you want to call this, revelation, there's still a large amount of the industry that is not there yet. How do you kind of deal with, clearly your company and the people that you deal with are there or past us, right? They're thinking way ahead, but you still have a lot of the end users and a lot of companies that rely on traditional non-digital, let's say, methods, or had to be dragged. Talk about your experience with that, because I think you have a great example of seafaring career, which is one of the oldest ones on the planet, no matter where you're from, and this digital career. Talk about bridging that gap.
So I think at the heart of it, I got to say, somewhere I was always tech focused in the weirdest possible sense. So, latest computer, video games of the time, all of that kind of stuff. So I always believe that somewhere there's an inherent connection, that you enjoy elements of this, although it doesn't come through at work, right? And I think then you have this natural affinity and natural attraction for the cool stuff in inverted commas. I think the other element of it, and you mentioned that in the introduction as well, I'm a real avid proponent and I'm almost obsessed with this idea of moving maritime forward is about bridging the domain expertise that makes maritime what it is, with connecting it with the technology competence that is extremely important, but also may not understand all the nuances of our industry. I mean, there are nuances, whether we like it or not. So when we hear phrases like the Uberization of freight, or you hear phrases like, the Amazon of the seas and things like that, I think the concept, yes, I understand it. But the only way you get adoption and traction is if you can actually bridge the here and now with the where you want to go. And so early on, I saw a couple of experiences, and you get really excited, right? You kind of fall in the hype cycle. So you get this epiphany, and then you think, all right, wow, I got to know what the latest things are. And you take a look at the Gartner quadrants, and you take a look at all the tech stuff that's happening in the B2C space, and then you get really excited and think about how it could be applied in B2B, and then you think about how it can be applied in maritime, and then you get a reality check. The bandwidth on the ship, forget about it, right? So then I realized this fundamental concept of the rest of the world moved to 5G, 4G, 5G, or now some people are even talking about 6G. Many of the ships are still sitting at like 1G and 2G. But what's starting to happen now is that connectivity on the ships, the bandwidth is getting much better. Costs are getting a lot cheaper. So what I like to say is that it almost feels like we're in a time machine. And the time machine is, on a Monday morning, we got to wake up and get back to like 1999. We got to get back to pre-YouTube. We got to get back to sort of MySpace kind of time, right? But that the bandwidth is increasing, costs are coming down, 3G, 4G is going to leapfrog even for the ships. And we're getting examples now where ships are sending, terabyte of data as well as use cases. Of course, it isn't prevalent, but as a use case, and definitely the amount they're being able to send is a lot larger. So what happens when connectivity improves? What happens is you get the maritime equivalent of the early days of Amazon, the early days of YouTube, the early days of whatever else people use. That understanding, that nuancing is what requires some level of bridging or some level of interpretation between the phenomenal tech capabilities and also the domain experts. I think the other element that I want to mention is we're also an inherently international industry. So regulations, this very complicated stakeholder map of charters, owners, managers, class, et cetera, there is no other industry on the planet that has that kind of stakeholder map. But where there is chaos, there is opportunity. And I think what I'm most excited about is this inherent desire that people want to make things better. We're seeing a generational shift in the office, which means people are finding it really difficult to go from 2022 on the weekend to 1999 on the weekdays. So I'm really hoping we can push forward here.
And that seems to be very ship specific, very ship driven. I did an interview where we talk about connectivity on the ships. And interestingly enough, it was one of the first times that we've talked about that connectivity on the ships. A lot of what I've been talking about has been focused on the shoreside workers, on documentation. And we've kind of shifted recently to look at the ship side of things, which is very interesting. And the same thing of keeping the ship connected, and then how is that going to benefit? And not in as much detail as this, but certainly very interesting. Question for you is as you're kind of going along and looking at this, what do you think is the biggest challenge you're seeing? And where you talk about opportunities, so the opportunities in chaos, but on the other end, where is that challenge?
Yeah, so I think it's probably going to be in three areas. I think the first thing is we got to recognize digital transformation is not about the technology. And I think companies that understand that are the ones who get it best. Digital transformation is a cultural shift. It's a mind shift. It's about the work processes. It's about the purpose of the company, elements. So what digital transformation does really more than anything else is it improves efficiency, but most importantly, it improves transparency and visibility. It creates efficiency because you get process collapses in the value chains that different people work on, both ashore and at sea, right? And I think that requires a mind shift. So there is an element where you can use technology to make a part of a process very efficient. Does that give you step change? No, but it's a starting point. What we're talking about now is that transformation requires step changes, and those step changes have to be addressed and looked at in a very different way. And I think the organizations that sort of look at this and hire tech with a view that anybody with domain expertise is literally not going to get it, they should be kept away, and then they can't talk to each other, and then what happens, right? Then the tech guys, okay, well, the current organization doesn't get it, so the tech guys, you need to move into another floor, and then you need to move to the corner, and then you guys are so super cool, you need to move to a co-working space, and the domain guys are sort of thinking, well, what the heck over here? That means that those guys are basically going to try to take over what we're doing, or they don't understand what we're doing. And instead of trying to get that adoption and excitement, you get a massive rift, and then neither team achieves anything. I think the first challenge in what I'm trying to explain is you've got to move away from these guys are threatening me from a domain side to these guys are here to make my job better, easier, faster, smarter, greener, whatever. Right? So I think that's the first challenge, which is a mind shift thing. The second challenge, I think, is that we are still in an industry which is highly regulated, and we're at that cusp where traditionally we're an industry that innovates on the back of regulation. We're moving now to a situation where we're innovating faster than the regulation. So instead of waiting for regulation and then figuring out what should we innovate on, we're an industry now that is doing that and innovating, and then regulation trying to figure out, oh my God, these things, we don't have rules for it, autonomy, 3D printed parts, whatever, right? And I think that's the second challenge where, as an industry, we can't sit back and wait for regulators. We've got to collaborate upfront in what I like to call regulatory sandboxes, safe spaces with the regulators on board saying, guys, you can test safely your ideas within these parameters here. Because you can't end up in a stalemate saying, no, this is not allowed, it's not allowed by the rules. Okay, when are you going to change the rules? But we're not changing the rules because there isn't any tech there. So, then you don't go anywhere. So I think that regulatory sandboxing is the second challenge. I think the third challenge I'm going to illustrate by, if you think of the industry as a pyramid, where on the top is, let's say, 10%, 10% of tonnage, 10% of the industry, whatever you want to call it, it's like the top 10%. They are the early adopters. They are the guys who are going to be able to have the funding. They want to try the stuff, whether it's new fuels, new tech, new business models, new whatevers. They're the ones who you see in the news all the time. That is really important because they're the ones who can afford and check and test whether things work out. They're almost the beacon of where the industry can go. You have the bottom 25% where, honestly, I'm not 100% sure they're going to make it through the transformation. But that's fine because maybe that's what they've come to the conclusion to, or they're just going to be, whatever you call it, last laggards, or, going to take a long while. The really important bit, and the bit that we sometimes forget, is the middle 65%. Now, the middle 65%, they want to change, but economic pressures, capacity pressures, whatever, not really being sure of it. But the middle 65% is the volume market where any kind of solution has got to survive for the industry to transform. So what I really advocate quite a lot is that you've got to do and be very conscious of what stage are you at. Speak to the top 10%, but you've got to also speak to the middle 65, do it together, because as solutions scale, they've got to address that middle market concern and their value proposition needs as well. And sometimes we see that getting left out.
That's really interesting on those 3 points. The one obviously is, playing it back. I kept on thinking about the age old. I mean, there have probably been libraries written about change management. So it's not really it's a change management issue, right? It's a who moved my cheese or whatever that book is.
Exactly.
And that is definitely one thing. I think we've kind of, as you mentioned earlier, with generational shift, I think that some of that's going to go away. I myself, as a proud Gen Xer, and even though like maybe I started getting to more of the end here, long ways from it, but definitely a Gen Xer, also being a smaller cohort. I think what you find from our group is we're very resilient. We don't really care what you want to do. Just get your job done, please, and leave me alone. I mean, it's so we're like, I think one of the early ones who embrace digital. Does that make my life easier? Great. Can you do it? Wonderful. Now go leave me alone. And I think that's at least kind of how I view this. Like this could help out. Like just let me do my job. And I think that that's important, but I think it is a change management issue, all kidding aside, and books and volumes have been written. I think the second point, which is really interesting about the regulatory part. Yeah, really interesting because here's what I think. I think it's going to happen a little different. I think they're going to have regulations, right? These 2030, 2050. I think what's going to happen is that companies are actually going to go ahead because of finance and ultimately the consumers. And we saw this a little bit last year, I think it was, where IKEA consumers were saying to IKEA, how come you're bringing that in on a stinky ship? I mean, basically, we want the best ship. And I think as consumer goods, you pick up your phone, you look at the box, you look at the carbon footprint of an iPhone versus a Google phone versus whatever, they're going to start looking at that footprint. Everything in the supply chain is going to ping on that. And I think that it's actually going to increase the amount. And I'm talking very specifically about emissions, but it's going to really focus on that because I think it's going to be money driven. And we're seeing this with the things of like Poseidon principles and Poseidon principles for insurance. I think that that's all money driven. I think it's going to be, we're not lending to you unless you're meeting these goals or exceeding these goals. We want you to be ahead of the curve because we know how fasting. And I think that the idea of having this incubator of going to the regulators and saying, hey, look, we're going fast because we kind of have to. And I think it's going to be very interesting. And those 2 points really stuck out. Going to your third point, I think you're absolutely right. Everybody forgets about the middle because they either want the rock stars or the other people. And you have to make sure that you focus on that middle one. Now, it could be a wide variety of what is middle. Some are going to be closer to one end or the other. But I think that's where effective communication comes in, maybe focusing on one early adopter within a company, and he or she will light the fire that'll make things. I see this all the time. You got to know the right person to talk to in that organization, and he or she will be like, oh, I'll be the adopter, and then people will just follow. And sometimes it's just a matter of going through the organizations and figuring that part out. Those are three very interesting points. Moving on, just kind of thinking, I talked about this recently, and this has been a topic, especially when we talked a little bit about autonomous shipping. What are kind of the downsides to all this digitization, especially in the rapid pace that we're doing this? What are you kind of encountering, especially being a seafarer and still having that connection there? What are you encountering there as a downside?
So I think a couple of different things there. I think cybersecurity, I'm not going to say it's a downside, but I'm going to say it's an area of risk that just needs to get far more highlighted and be very conscious of as you're getting more and more digital pipes on the ships, but also ashore. I think that's going to be really important. Both talent and capital I'm going to mention. So I'm not going to say that it's a downside, but what I'm going to say is that means we need different kinds of talent. If we don't address the attraction of talent into the industry, we're going to end up in some sort of a limbo where you're going to end up with solutions that need new talent, but no ability to attract the talent. And that's going to be really, really dangerous and very unfortunate as well. So I think just as an industry, a lot more conscious about, what kind of talent do we need in the future? How do we attract it? How do we retain it? And bear in mind, in the early days, it isn't even a competition between people in the industry. It's a competition of this industry versus another industry. And I think that's something where we've got to come together a lot better on.
Pivoting real quick there, what would you suggest to people who are interested, like someone's coming out of school, maybe it's a maritime or a merchant
Yeah.
navy school, or not, or you have a relative or a neighbor, in there,
Yeah.
just graduate from university. What would you say to them about coming into the industry? Because I think that this is, a really interesting industry that I love. I wouldn't change anything, but how would you attract them to jump in?
Yeah, so I think the thing is that so recently, for all the wrong reasons, the maritime or the shipping industry's got a lot of press, right? For all the wrong reasons. At least it's got press. I mean, it hit the front page of the New York Times for the Suez Canal incident and so on and so forth, supply chain resilience. But I think what that underscores and what we need to do better is to remind people, increase awareness dramatically around this is a core backbone industry for international trade. And I think what's happened over the years is that, the industry is kind of built on, it's really small or feels really small. It's built on information arbitrage. We don't really proudly go out and trumpet what we do and things like that. I think we just got to change it. It's a branding exercise. I was joking with somebody in Singapore recently where I was saying, you know what, on each product in the supermarkets or the department stores, we should have like a little tag that says brought to you by MV, whatever. Because it's really easy to pretend like everything is just magically teleported to us. And it isn't. And I think that's what this industry stands for. So when I look at so talent and capital for me are indicators of how an industry is going to evolve, particularly in an early stage. What I'm seeing now, and if you look at some of the pitch book reports, the maritime industry was actually highlighted as an emerging opportunity space for venture capital. Now it's ironic because it's been around for like 3,000 years or whatever. But anyway, it's an emerging opportunity space. And when you start to get that capital interested, supply chain tech has gone off the charts. So, and now they're recognizing that maritime is a core part of supply chain. So you get that capital attracted. What happens when capital gets attracted and the problem is big enough? You get smart people attracted, you get talent attracted, wanting to solve some of these problems. I think what we really need to do is, again, coming back to this, the domain expert connection piece, which is an important element. We need to make sure that there's what I call founder problem fit. Like you've got to have when you're in the early stages, when you're working on a problem, the way people back you with money is before you have a product, before you have anything, you've got to kind of have that right to play, right? And you've got to have that credibility. So I think founder problem fit is a really important piece. And I really hope more seafarers, more people ashore, more traders, more brokers, more charters, whoever want to get into this space of just challenging the current business models, working with other founders. And then you've got to have product market fit. So then what I really hope to see is people don't get excited by just demos and POCs, but really get excited by validating, these propositions, making it very, very demand worthy and valuable to the middle of the pyramid, like I said. And that's when you get scaling. And I'm really, really optimistic and super excited for the next few years when I believe some of these early solutions are going to start scaling, some because of the regulation, some because consumers are just going to demand a better service all around, and some because I think that we just simply have to be better.
I live in a very interesting part of the world. I live in Southwest Connecticut, 50, 60 miles from New York City. A lot of people are in finance. About a year ago, I got a phone call from somebody I know through my son's baseball, private equity guy. Hey, maritime, right? What's going on in that space? Same conversation 6 months ago, different guy.
Exactly right.
Hey, maritime. So all of a sudden, here we are, a 3,000-year-old industry, all sorts of reputation about how you want to be everything, from Captain Ahab to everything in the middle. And here we are, people are finally interested from a finance point of view. And it's and I'm not looking for these conversations. They're just happening like at the ball field as we're waiting for the boys to warm up. We're just chit chatting. And then somebody, these people put one and one together and, what's going on in that space and things like that. And I think that the most important thing is that deep domain experience, because I think you touched upon another kind of problem, and that is having a whiz bang product with no problem behind it. a known
Exactly right.
problem that you can walk into any chartering shop, any agency, ship surveyor, and go, that is a problem that you have that's replicated hundreds of times all over the place, and here's a solution for that problem. And I know because I was a ship surveyor, I was a broker, or whatever it is. I know that problem, and I can help you fix that problem.
Exactly right.
One of the things, going back to your earlier comment about, having the dev team here and then the deep domain people. One thing that I try to do at my current role is, I have an open door for my dev team, and I tell them, hey, we're talking about something the other day, with my developer, and I said, oh, well, we don't have to worry about that. That's a RoRo. What's that?
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, and then the beauty of not even being in the office, but having, oh, hold on a second, screen share. I go, think of a giant floating shoebox, with all due respect to my RoRo sailors, from the outside, that's what it looks like. Click on the button. Really? I go, yeah. I go, it's a parking lot. They bring cars in, they tie them down.
Exactly right.
They go, really? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, how do you think your car gets here? Well, now, Toyota, they're built in the US, but how do you think you get your car here? They don't fly cars here. And I explained I had a short hitch as a cadet on a RoRo. But the point is I think that's incumbent both ways, right? It's incumbent on deep domain people to educate their non-domain people internally. I think it's incumbent on us to do that. And I'm not afraid of somebody taking my job. And just as I always appreciate when the marketing people or when the developers say, hey, this is what we're doing. Okay, what are you doing there? Okay, well, I'm linking this SQL query with this other one, and this is how oh, cool. Okay, so you could do that, right? And I've actually taken a few very basic, like, how-to SQL classes just so I can understand.
Exactly right. And I think that's exactly what you need.
And that's where, because then you can, the
you get a common language,
right? And maybe the limitations of what can be done right now. Maybe you hear about new technology. How is this different? It's not really different. They're just marketing it different. You could talk. And I think that's one of the most important things, that it has to work both ways, right? Because if it's all like, well, no, I'm just a domain expert, you come to me, that never works in life. And if you have the developers go, I just do code, that's it, I don't want to learn anything else, well, that's no good either. You got to have this kind of
spot on, exactly right. I mean, I think it's, meeting in the middle doesn't mean one party goes to the other side.
No, it just means, certainly I always I ventured on in this area 4 years ago. I kind of knew, I knew digital tools and how to use them, but I'm always learning, and I love to talk to my team and hear more about this and hear what problems you're encountering. As product manager, I don't do the code, but I have to manage. It's really interesting, and I think that's part of a way over it. As we start to wrap up, we're kind of touching a little bit on collaboration internally, but you talk about collaboration externally, and we've had a few people on here who tout that. Talk a little bit about what what your view is on that, what you're kind of doing, because I think that you talked also earlier about a part of collaboration, which is transparency, and there's always been a kind of hesitancy between, you have competitors, two ship owners, two charters, and there's also rules around them talking, right? And there has to be a quote unquote safe space, as you mentioned. So talk a little bit about the collaboration and what you're seeing, and kind of, how that's been progressing, and what your views are on that.
Yeah, and I think it's been improving across the board really well. I think, from our own experience. So in the early days, we started corporate venturing with, of course, feeling like we had all the answers, right? I mean, so we sort of huddled in a room, and yes, we got the tech guys, and we were building something, and we thought we had a great product. And then when we went externally, we had what I call a wow product, right up to the point that somebody had to pay for it. And then it was like, oh, yeah, gosh, that sounds really expensive, or I don't really need all of it, or whatever. And I think the learning from that was that we needed to look at this a different way. And oddly enough, one of the titles I had a few years ago was VP Open Innovation. And people used to ask me, they say, well, I know VP Innovation. Why do you put Open Innovation? It was like a conversation starter. It was like an icebreaker, because I really wanted to introduce this concept, actually, that was put forward by Henry Chesbrough, of course, in the West Coast of the US, which was really organizations understanding that they needed to embrace permeable organizational boundaries. You needed to have the ability to share certain things externally, to bring external things internally, and be comfortable with spinning in, spinning out, going off into a different market, and being totally safe about it. Of course, some of the difficulty is around, oh, IP, or, oh my God, but this is my idea and I don't want to share it. But I always say, 100% of nothing is not as good as 50% of something. So it's better to work together. And that's when we started talking about consortiums, building ecosystems, working across with representation across the value chain, working with our customers, but are also customers, our suppliers and our suppliers. And it makes such a big difference because actually everybody's got the same problem. It's just at a different part of the chain. And the amount of value you get in the end product of being able to share that across, apart from the fact that you have captive customers, which is a really great thing to do. And then we have the regulators in. So getting class in on certain areas really helps fast track that. And I think that was a really big learning. And what I'm seeing now is maritime specific or supply chain specific VC funds with LPs that are kind of in the same space, including maritime, that forces them to talk. We're seeing in incubators and accelerators, players from the same space, whether it's ship owners, ship managers, charters, or whatever, offering problem statements. And it isn't like top secret. I mean, honestly, everybody's got the same problems. And the last thing I'm going to say is anybody who believes they have a 1 in a million idea, just remember that there's 7,000 other people on the planet who got the idea.
The special sauce is how do you take that 1 in a million
Exactly
idea
right.
and run with it? And is it the deep domain experience? Is it execution? Is it just, getting those touch points? And I look at, 1 or 2 historical ideas and just go, multiple people have tried them. Now you got like 4 or 5 in the space and, you try to figure out the differentiator. But as we start to wrap up, one of the things I love to ask is maybe with the traveling that you do, this is a good question for you, but what are you reading? Is there anything interesting that you're reading, that you're bringing on the plane? And I've had people answer this by saying I'm writing a book. I had that a couple of times, which is kind of interesting. And I've had that with somebody saying, I have some very young kids. I listen to audiobooks, which is not cheating. So I thought that was very good as well.
Yeah, I'm an avid reader. I contribute regularly to articles and things like that. I'm an avid reader. I think, and this is going to sound really a little bit strange, but we're in the middle of running an internal venture program. So I'm actually going back and reading up on value proposition canvases and business model canvases from Strategizer. And it sounds really obvious, but when you're running these venture programs, it's really useful to get back to basics and just ask these fundamental assumption questions. So that's on the sort of the business side, and on the personal side, I just love conspiracy theory type fiction, and you could take your pick, but I love them all.
There's a good series of books, if you like historical fiction, by an author called Alan Furst, Furst, and he writes these books set around World War II. They're all based on real events, but fake people in and around these events.
Right.
And what's amazing about it, so you read the first one, and then let's say they got 4 main characters and 10 kind of also rans. Well, one of those also rans is now the feature character in book number 2.
Yeah.
And then the main character is on 1 page in book and he does this. And if you like that, because it's not necessarily, conspiracy like Dave Brown or, those
Derek
books.
Brown.
But they're pretty interesting. A book that I'm reading, and maybe maybe you'll tell me you'll never want to talk to me again, that I find amazingly interesting. And it puts a view on this because this person was held up in reverence, is The Man Who Broke Capitalism, about Jack Welch.
Yeah, I've heard about that. I've read the synopsis, actually. It's quite interesting.
It's like you read this and you go, okay, this is really interesting. And maybe some of the stuff that you're seeing with the labor unions now trying to say, hey, we want ours back. They're just trying to you talked about going back to 1999. They're just trying to get back to 1980. We just want to get back to like some sort of parity here. And I'm not taking a stance. I'm just, kind of stating what I see is happening in the real world, in kind of the real world out there with labor unions and everything. And what this book has described has been happening. I'm about halfway through. It's a fascinating, easy read too, because you're reading this and you're like, The way the author writes it is pretty good. Highly recommended.
Yeah,
If
no,
you
but
get
I
a
think what you
chance.
mentioned is that's really important. It's not about taking stance, but it's about appreciating all the perspectives. And I think as human beings, that is the one thing that we have the ability to do that I'm not sure any other species does. We have the ability to empathize, and we have the ability to understand or at least appreciate everybody's perspectives. From an innovation side, that is like innovation 101. And so I think, whether we agree or not is a different thing, but at least recognizing there are different perspectives.
Quote from one of my favorite books, To Kill a Mockingbird: "You don't know a person until you walk a mile in their shoes." I mean, you don't know
Yeah,
what they think, what they do, and if you could have that empathy, which is now one of the top business leader skill sets to have, forget about the
exactly right.
MBA I have back there, but you got to have empathy, and is definitely one of the best skill sets. Well, this was a great interview. Nakul, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. I appreciate your perspective and your view, but thank you for coming on the podcast.
I really enjoyed it, Chris. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing more.
I hope you enjoy listening to this episode of The Last Dinosaur. You can find out more about Nakul and what he's been doing at Wilhelmsen through links in the show notes. Also, a special shout out to a previous guest, Captain Steve Baumgartner, who introduced me to Nakul. Thanks, Steve. The Last Dinosaur can be found in all the places you normally get your podcasts, such as iTunes, Amazon, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and we have a YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Aversano, wishing you fair winds and following seas.